Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our next Meet the Experts event. This morning, we're going to be talking to Professor Brian Carlson about biological sciences. Our first question is, what is biological science?
Yeah, that's a big question, actually. One of the great things about biological science is it's actually a really big field. There's a lot that falls under that umbrella. So broadly speaking, biological science is going to be the study of life in general and how it works. That's to put it at its most basic level. But what's really neat about that is it takes in, say, for example, understanding how energy from the sun got transferred through plants and animals and things to come to me to give me the energy, to use my lungs and move my vocal cords to talk to you today. So that's part of biological science. But so is understanding how the individual atoms of carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and other things come together to make the DNA that gives us the instructions for how to build our bodies. And so sort of everything in between there, that all is sort of the purview of biological science. So it's a really big field.
Wow, it does sound like a really big field. What are some examples of careers that you could have in biological science?
So there are a lot of careers that you can have in biological science. If the most obvious that people often think of when they think about, I'm going to get a degree in biology, is people think, oh, I'm going to get a degree in biology, and then I'm going to go on to medical school, dental school, veterinary school, something of that nature. So there's all sorts of healthcare related things that you can do with a degree in biology. There are people like me who go on to study biology, and so I'm a professor at a college. And I teach, I've taught introductory biology, I've taught about cells, I've taught about genetics. So there are sort of educational approaches you can take. And, if you get a degree in biology, you can teach at just about any level. If you're going to teach, high schoolers or below that, you need to get additional certifications. But a lot of times there's sort of programs that'll, help you with that. But then outside of that, you can work in private industry. So you can go and work for P&G, or, you can work for, one of these companies that is developing these amazing vaccines that we are now seeing that we're hopefully going to be getting into our arms soon. You can work, in the public sector. So you can work for the government, you can work on managing parks, you can work on water quality, you can work on things like that. The other thing that I like to point out, though, too, is that I've recently seen more and more people in the field of biology that use the degree in biology to do things like technical writing. So maybe you go write for a scientifically oriented magazine where your goal is to take, or maybe you're doing, public relations for a government agency where your goal is to take scientific concepts or scientific procedures and make them more accessible to the public. So you're sort of using your talents with language for that. So there's really just a whole variety of different things. And the wonderful thing about biological science is it's always growing, it's always changing. And so there will be opportunities for you, if you go into biological science, in terms of jobs that you could get that don't even exist now, that will exist by the time that you would have your degree.
Wow, that's really exciting. If you wanted to go into a career in biological science, what opportunities are there at NKU for that?
In terms of where you would start in terms of getting your degree?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a biological sciences program, and there are a number of tracks inside of it. So some people are more focused on ecology and the environment and things like that. So there's an environmental studies program, and there are different focuses within our biological sciences program that you can sort of do that. There are more molecular focuses. So people who are more interested in chemistry and biochemistry and genetics and the way sort of these little pieces inside of our cells give us instructions or make us work. There are routes for that as well. If you're really interested in neuroscience, so understanding how the brain works and why we behave the way we do and things like that, there's also a neuroscience program. So there's a lot of different opportunities. And the thing too that I also like to point out is what I always try to tell people is, in large part, a college degree, one of the biggest things that it does is it shows that you're a trainable person. Okay, so if there's a job out there that you want, you can think about what is going to be the most direct point A to B, but what you get your degree in doesn't necessarily limit you in terms of your career opportunities, for the rest of your life. So people who, you might start in biology and decide you want to go a little bit different, you can easily do that. You might start a little bit different and you decide you want to get into biology, you can do that too. I have a colleague that I worked with at the College of Worcester who was trained as a physicist. She has a PhD in physics, but she's a biologist now. She's a computational biologist, so she models how cells work in computers. And that was sort of she's a biologist, she's a full-fledged biologist, but she came to us through physics. And so there are a lot of ways that you can go right into biology, but also remember that choosing something as, an 18-year-old going off to college doesn't set the course for the rest of your life, or at least it doesn't have to.
That sounds really interesting and exciting, being able to work between the different fields and use it for biological science. So what about you? Where did you go to school and what did you study?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I went, actually, I was all schooled locally. So I went to Xavier University for my undergraduate. And while I was there, I was gung-ho pre-med, which is part of what made my decision to go to Xavier. So while I was there, I majored in biology, and I also actually had a second major in German, and then minors in chemistry and environmental studies. So that's what I studied. And after that, or I guess during that, I was, like I said, I was gung-ho pre-med, and I was bound and determined that I was going to become a doctor, and there was no class, nothing was going to be too hard, nothing was going to stop me. What I wasn't prepared for was, in my case, after shadowing doctors and after working in a pharmacy for a couple of years and things like that, I realized, this isn't actually what I want to do with my life. And I wasn't ready for that. I sort of had this, I call it my mid-college crisis, because I was like, oh, I didn't expect this at all. I expected it would be hard and I would just keep working and I would get through it. But I didn't expect coming to a point where I decided this wasn't what I wanted to do. So I sort of had a little bit of a breakdown, honestly, to be vulnerable about that. And fortunately, I had that breakdown in the right professor's office. I went and talked with Dr. Farnsworth, who still teaches at Xavier, and was trying to figure out what to do now, like what now. And he offered me a research position for the summer. So I went in his office sort of with my life seemingly in shambles for myself, and I came out with a new direction. And as I was working with him and Dr. Engel, who's also over there, I sort of realized, wait, I've always liked teaching people things. I've always liked helping people learn, and I like research, and these people basically use research as a teaching tool. That sounds really cool. So from that point on, I decided, okay, well, I want to teach biology like my research advisor do. And so that kind of became my goal. So I refocused, finished up at Xavier, and then I went down the street to the University of Cincinnati, where I did a PhD in biological sciences. What's interesting is some people think that you have to find a program that like super fits the, some people put really flashy names on programs, and it's mostly a marketing tool. So my degree says biological science, but what matters is what I was trained in. So I went to the University of Cincinnati and I did a program in biological science, but I was in a lab where we studied genetics. We studied genetics in these blind Mexican cave fish that you can see at the aquarium. In fact, if you go to the aquarium at any time soon, a lot of those fish probably came out of my lab because they had an issue where the power went out and they lost some of their cave fish. And so the lab that I came out of was kind enough to donate some of our lab stocks. So you may see fish that actually came from that lab. So that was a 5-year process of getting that PhD. And you're learning how to be a scientist as you go through that. One thing that I like to dispel, you take some classes as a graduate student in biology, but a lot of it is just doing science, doing research, and learning how to be a scientist. So you're not in the classroom all the time. Some people, it's like, oh, you went to 5 more years of school. Well, yeah, I did, but it wasn't like 5 more years of like classes all day, every day like you have now. And so coming out of that, I knew I wanted to teach. Oftentimes after coming out of a PhD, people do what's called a postdoc, where basically you have a doctorate, you are an independent researcher, but you still need a little bit more training and guidance. And so what you do is you basically go in and sort of apprentice in someone else's lab. So you don't have to figure out where all the grant funding and everything is coming from necessarily, but you have a place to work and someone who can continue to guide you and teach you. I decided I didn't want to do that because I knew I wanted to teach. And I'm like, why would I spend more years doing something that isn't teaching just so that I can go into teaching? So I made the jump directly from working on my PhD into a visiting assistant professorship at the College of Worcester, which is in Northeast Ohio. And I was there for 5 years. I really enjoyed my experience, but it was time for me to make a change, and an opportunity at Northern Kentucky University brought me to Cincinnati again over the summer, and I'm happy to be here.
That's awesome. I mean, I think a lot of folks like to hear that you don't have it all completely figured out from the beginning, that you can totally change your mind. What are some common challenges that you've been facing as a biological scientist?
I think some of the challenges that I face, so as a scientist, sometimes you can get sort of information overload. So there's so much information out there that you don't quite know where to start when you're trying to conceive of an experiment. We're getting more and more into just working with big data sets. So for example, a lot of the publications that I have on my record, I'm an internal author somewhere in the middle, and it's because somebody had a data set that they didn't know how to work with. They had gotten the data and they, out of, gene expression or something like that. So how much of these genes are turned on in these cells at any given time? They have all that data, but they don't know how to make heads or tails out of it. So just being able to help them process that data, make sense out of it, and help them create a story of here's what's going on here has gotten me a number of authorships. So sometimes you get that sort of data overload. Obviously, always looking for funding and things like that. The work that we do as scientists. I mean, I have colleagues that just go out there. I have a colleague named Dr. Parker in the department who goes out with buckets and looks for mosquito larvae in discarded tires. That's pretty cheap work to do. The stuff that I do, everything starts with a kit that costs $500 right off the bat for the first step of the process. And so ours is really expensive. So sometimes finding the funding to support that and finding people who are willing to put put money behind your work basically can be a challenge. From a mentoring, advising perspective, which a lot of us have to do, again, getting students to see that you don't have to get straight A's all the way through, or that it's okay to change your mind, it's okay to explore other options, there are other things in biology. That's sometimes a challenge to help sort of people widen their view beyond, well, I thought I wanted to do this and now I'm going to do this. So those are all some of the challenges that we face in the different aspects of our jobs.
Yeah, it always kind of sounds like some of the real challenges people face have to do more with like paperwork and funding and less with the fun, cool stuff they get to do as part of what they studied.
Yeah, definitely.
So who do you work with, and are you part of a team?
Yeah, so I'm big on collaboration. That's one thing that I really like. So I'm always working with, to some level or another with a variety of other people, either other researchers at other institutions, or when I was working at the College of Worcester, I was working every year with a group of 4 to 6 students that were working on their senior thesis, where they would have to design their own project and execute it and then write it up as sort of a, this 40-some page document about here's what I did to contribute to science. So working with that. Currently, I'm only working with one other person. I've got one student because my lab is just starting up, but eventually I'll have a team of undergrads here at NKU that'll be working with me on my science. So yeah, I'm always working with a variety of people. It just kind of depends on which project we're talking about.
Well, that's a great segue into what are you studying right now?
Yeah, so I'm actually, my research program is in a little bit of flux because I moved from one institution to another. What I have been studying, and I will probably continue to study to some capacity, is, so I mentioned that I worked with blind Mexican cavefish in my graduate work. Fun story, one thing that people that study blind Mexican cavefish are really good at doing is creating more people who study blind Mexican cavefish. And it's a really interesting study system. It's been compared to what white lab rats are to other fields in biology. Mexican cavefish are sort of the white rat of studying cave biology and cave evolution. So that's actually become a little bit too competitive for me without having graduate students and with having the teaching responsibilities that I do. And so I've tried to work into what I call non-model systems. So these are things where you can't just go up and look the sequence of all the genes up on the internet. We don't know these things yet. And some people, especially students who are just learning about genetics, sort of have this idea that if that information isn't there already, then we have to just kind of wait for somebody else to find it. And so what I do is I try to show my students and in my own work to work in non-model species where there isn't that information, and do rewarding, potentially illuminating work anyway, but also develop tools that will help other people come along after me. I always tell people if I'm doing a really good job and being very productive, I should have to switch the study system that I'm working in every couple of years because I've made it more accessible to people. So what I had started working in while I was in the College of Worcester and will likely continue to do is Siamese fighting fish, those fish you see in the little cups at the pet stores. Mm-hmm. If there's different shapes, there's different colors, there's different sizes, and that has all happened based on people saying, hey, that looks kind of neat. Let me take two that look like that and breed them together and see if we continue getting that. And so what's happening there is nobody's manipulating them in the lab or anything like that. So it's all natural mutations. There are things that are occurring naturally that are causing things to look differently or act differently. And then people are selectively breeding those. So instead of some of you may have heard of natural selection, we call this artificial selection. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, well, what sort of changes at the genetic level? If you think about your genome as like a cookbook, right? And then the recipes that you make are the things that come from that cookbook. Okay, so what changes happen in the cookbook to make the dish come out like this instead of like that? And so I've been looking at, started to look at color, fin shape, levels of aggression, things like that in the species. And then I've also started working on, with my current advanced molecular biology students, we're working in a different species. They're called tiger barbs. And some of you, if you keep fish, you may be familiar with tiger barbs. If you don't, you may not have seen them, but you probably walk past them in a pet store. But they're these sort of, almost diamond-shaped fish that have, black stripes, and they got red on their fins. They're pretty cool looking. But we have also, in addition to that, we have fish that are albino, so they don't have any melanin-based pigmentation. And then we have what they call the mossy green barbs, which are the same ones, but they look kind of green. It's almost like you just like spread dark green paint all over them. And what's interesting is that's actually not green. It is shiny over black. And the way that the light refracts through that makes it look green. The same goes with blue. A lot of things in nature, they aren't actually a blue pigment, especially animals. When you see something that looks blue, it's not blue, it's how the light refracts through it. In fact, even your eyes, if you have blue eyes, there's no blue color there. It's just how the light plays in the molecules of your eyes. But anyway, so we're looking at these two things and saying, okay, well, what genes could have switched on or off or be functioning differently to make a fish that's normally striped with black stripes not have any black on it at all? And so my students have gone into the literature and they're trying to figure that out. And they said, okay, here are our guesses. And so our next step in the lab is to say, okay, let's go check. Let's see if there's anything weird going on.
Wow, that's awesome. So I think our last question, I always love this question because I think people like to know, do you get to travel for your job?
Yeah, there are a lot of opportunities to travel. One of the biggest ones is when we are, part of the reason of doing science is to share your work, right? And part of the way that you do that is by publishing. Another way that you do that, and you also sort of network, is by going to conferences. So, a couple of years ago, it was, January 4th, and I was in, Tampa, Florida, enjoying nicer weather down there, but also talking about my science and learning about what other people were doing. So there's always a chance to travel for conferences. If you have more of a field component to your research, then there's the chance to travel to go into the field. Otherwise, there's collaborations. There's also, if you are in a university position, oftentimes if you end up with a research sabbatical, people will often relocate, go to an entirely different place, another state, sometimes even another country, to work on something that they wouldn't have had the time or the facilities to work on in their home lab. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of opportunities to travel, for sure.
Very cool. If you do have questions, please start putting them in the chat. While we're waiting on that, would you mind just maybe talking about anything that you felt like we didn't cover yet, or anything interesting that you're doing right now?
Yeah. So one thing that I wanted to circle back to is, so I have noticed, and the reason that I talk about my sort of mid-college crisis is students often think that, especially if you're in a job like mine where it's like, oh, you're the smart people, right? That like everything just works out and we always know exactly what we're doing, and things like that. When my advisor came and visited at the College of Worcester and he gave a talk and he was talking with students, one of the things they liked best and like really like made him accessible is, so this is Dr. Joshua Gross at the University of Cincinnati. He is one of the smartest people I know. And I know a lot of smart people. But what you find out about him when you talk to him is his undergrad is in psychology, not biology. And he went to medical school and he couldn't get into medical school in the US. So he went to medical school in Ireland and that didn't really work out. And he left after a year. And then he went and did some other things. And then he went in and did his postdoc, his PhD and his postdoc, and that was what really set his career. But he comes across as this extremely put together, knows everything, has a plan, extremely hardworking, extremely intelligent person. But what students really like to find out that he had these sort of struggles and this sort of path. So the path may seem to you like it's supposed to be a straight line, but more often than not, the path is really crooked and crosses back on itself and stuff. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that you don't have your life together or you're doing something wrong. It's something that it happens to everybody. The other thing too is a lot of times, even just about the science, I don't know if any of you have had to read a scientific paper or read about an experiment, but when you read a scientific paper in particular, or particularly a bigger work, everything's laid out in a really logical way. And it's like, oh, I can see where this leads to this, leads to this. The very first thing that I did when I was working on my doctorate is the last chapter in my dissertation. It is the last thing that I wrote up. It is the last thing that got published, but it was the very first data that I collected. So also know that things may seem very organized in how they're presented, and that's to make it accessible to the reader. But oftentimes it's not that linear and logical, and you get into something and you realize, oh, well, we really need to account for this, or should we check this? And so again, even with, in a research program or in your education, things are going to be sort of crossing over, making different decisions, noticing new things. Don't be afraid to explore, and don't be afraid to deviate from what the path you think that you should be taking, shortest point A to B, if there are, valuable experiences or just more exploring that you need to do along the way.
So we do have a question, and I think it's actually pretty tied to what you were just talking about. So Olivia says, I'm very interested in the sciences. I have enjoyed biology, chemistry, etc. Instead of going into those sciences, however, I am planning on going into nursing. How does nursing compare to biology?
So, there's a lot of overlap. You're going to have to take a lot of biology classes to go into nursing, especially a lot of, so you obviously need to know anatomy. You need to know the different systems of the body. You need to know the different bones, the different parts of them. You need to know where major blood vessels are, things like that. But you also need to know, one of the things that we sort of falls under biological sciences is microbiology. So if you're going to be dealing with people that are going to be sick with different bacteria and viruses and things like that, you need to take courses to really have an understanding of how that stuff works and what does the culture of this look like? How could this particular organism cause you to have this particular type of symptom? So there's a lot of tie-in. It's more applied. You're doing less theory and more learning how things work and what you're going to need to do as a nurse. But other than that, a lot of the things that you're going to be learning are very closely tied to biology.
Awesome. So that right now is currently the only question that we've gotten from students. And we can definitely give it a few more minutes and see if we get any more. Is there anything else that you think you might want to mention?
So let me open up a file real quick. I'll be able to share my screen, won't I?
Yeah, so down on the bottom it says share, and then we'll change your format there so we can.
Okay. I'm going to open up this PowerPoint real quick. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you an extensive PowerPoint. It's just, it'll give me pictures so I can sort of go through some of the sorts of questions I was talking about in the work that I'm doing now. And we can stop and jump to whatever questions people have as they come in, but this might spur more questions, or it might just give us something more to talk about for a minute. So let me find this really quick. One thing while I'm finding this, so I used to work on the orientation crew when I was at the College of Worcester, and one thing that I try to also stress to students is either students or parents can become really, really keyed in on, you need to take all classes directly associated with your major or your career. There are talented people, talented advisors and talented mentors who will make sure that you have whatever courses you need to graduate. As long as you listen to the advisors that you're appointed, you will have whatever you need to be prepared for the sort of career that you need, and to graduate on time with the degree that you want. But some of the things that people often miss, I like to point out is, so when I think back to what I would do differently if I could go back and do my undergraduate studies again, so when I was getting my bachelor's degree, I would take more classes outside of my major if I could. That would be what I would do. Can you see this now, this fish?
Yes. So,
okay, beautiful.
There we go. This should be up there now.
Okay, good. So I'll finish what I was saying here, though. Explore. Don't be afraid to explore. And in particular, if you're like, I think I want to do this, but I might also want to do this, make sure that you explore. I always tell people the classes that you take in your major will make you employable. The classes that you take outside of your major will make you interesting at dinner parties and at an interview with a potential boss in the job that you want. So don't get so focused in on your particular thing. One more class in biology if you're going to become a biologist, or one more class in biology if you're going to become a doctor or want to write on science policy, is not going to make the difference between you getting the job you want or not, unless it's a very specific class. But by and large, it's not going to make the difference. So get what you need, but also make sure that you explore, and at the very least, it's going to make you a very well-rounded person. So I always like to throw out a plug for that. Also, study abroad if you have the ability. That is one thing I didn't get to do because I was so focused on my science, and it's something that I really wish, because I would get more out of my German major if I had been able to study abroad. So anyway, what I wanted to show you is some of the things that we're sort of thinking about. So this is Betta splendens. This is, again, the Siamese fighting fish, as they're commonly called, that you can sort of see in a pet store. And what's interesting is fish like this, some of the questions that I'm interested in and I've either started looking at or want to look at are what sort of underlies the variation. So I was talking about this before. So in the wild, these fish look like this. Now this is a particularly pretty specimen, but that's a lot different than what we see in the pet store, right? It's very, the shape of the fins are different. There's a lot less coloration on the body. It's more of a brown. The iridescence isn't as spread out. This is what we sort of start with. But starting from that, without doing anything in a laboratory to modify them genetically or anything, we've taken things like this and gotten things that look like all of these. And so the question is, what sort of levers are we pulling? What switches are we throwing, in terms of the sequence of the genome to take a fish that looked like that and wind up with a fish that looks like one of these here. Okay, so you can see the different fin patterns, you can see different coloration patterns, levels of darkness versus lightness, etc. Okay, so what are we doing that's changing that? Next thing is we have these different tail types. And we can see this is what we call a crown tail here. So, we have these fin rays that extend past the edge of what the normal fin would be. So that's, potentially like a skeletal thing. So what's going on in the skeleton? So I had students that were clearing and staining fish so they could look at, this is a specimen that has been, a lot of the tissue has been cleared out and it's been rendered, mostly clear and then stained with a stain called alizarin red that allows you to see the bones. And so we can see how many bones, where they are, what size they look like. And we were starting to find that when you look at not just the tail, but the rest of the skeletal structure of some of these fish, you're seeing changes beyond just the change in the shape of the tail. You're seeing other things there. So this is sort of an interesting thing that we're looking at. We also see that even though these fish, so you know that the reason they're in those little cups is because you can't keep the males together. They fight. That's why they're Siamese fighting fish. But we found that there are differences in aggression. Not all males are as aggressive as others, which is why you'll see sometimes people post in an online forum are like, oh, I had a male and he got along just fine. And another one says, this male killed every other fish in my tank. There are differences in aggression. And one thing that we can do that's been used to study this is we can actually use behavioral rig to take fish like this. And what we can do is put them in a rig. So this is one of the signs of aggression. They flare out their fins and they also raise their gill flaps. So some of you may have seen it. If you hold a mirror up to one of these, they'll sort of do that. So we sort of take that approach. And what we have over here, if you look at this is, I don't know why it ends up being yellow, but this is a heat map that showed over a 5-minute period, there's a mirror on the right side of this tank here, away from I think you can see my cursor here. So sort of away from this side, there's a mirror over here. So this fish sort of explored the tank a little bit, but he sort of stayed away from that mirror, okay? We had another fish, same species, did that. He was really interested in staying at that mirror and, saying like, hey, you want to make something out of this? You want to fight? Let's go. Let's throw down, okay? So you can see there's differences in aggression there. And so we wanted to see, okay, well, we have these measurable differences in aggression. Is there something in their genetic code that's making this fish on the right a lot more aggressive than this fish on the left? Okay. The other thing we want to know is, what do these fish see? So we get so focused on, oh, look how pretty, look at the fins, whatever. So, we're seeing this, but if the fish can't see that well and they see this instead, which a lot of animals do have vision that's sort of like that, well, what does it matter then? Then it's probably big blotches of color matter more than, other things that would be more subtle but visible to our eyes. So that's another thing that I was working with a collaborator who works on vision to see, like, what can they see? What do they look like to each other? Okay.
All right, we do have another question.
All right.
We talked about this a little earlier, but maybe we can do a refresher.
Yeah.
What are major jobs that people can have once getting a biology degree? And then as a follow-up, are they drastically different from jobs that you can get with a nursing degree?
Yeah, so it all depends on exactly what sort of job, for my job, you generally have to have if you're going to teach college, you generally need to have either a master's degree in a related field, or you need to have a doctorate. So if you had your associates or your bachelor's in nursing, you wouldn't necessarily have what you need to go into my field. But if you wanted to, for example, go into a lab technician position or something like that, a lot of the skills, a lot of the techniques, keeping things sterile, knowing how to follow protocols, things like that would definitely transfer easily over to a position like that. Similarly, again, if you are a nurse and you're having to explain these technical biological based concepts to a patient who might be somebody who barely finished the 8th grade or something like that, making it accessible, or somebody who doesn't speak English as a first language, and trying to make things accessible to them so you can explain the treatment options or explain what's happening to them. That sort of communication and taking more complex concepts and bringing that out to the public could go into a lot of different degrees in sort of the more public facing side of science. A lot of times also people who start in sort of as an RN end up doing things where they become a nurse anesthetist, or they become a nurse practitioner, so things like that. So that gets a little bit more into sort of the nuts and bolts of diagnosing and things like that. That would be a sort of not an adjacent medicine is part of biological science, but sort of its own sort of subfield. That would be something that you could easily go into. So a lot of it depends on when you decide to make a change and what you're changing from what and to what. But a lot of people are flexible, and again, a lot of times it's showing that you have a background in something and showing that you're trainable and being able to highlight those skills that are transferable from the job that you have to the job that you want. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't see any more questions.